But I'd like to turn today to our presentation by Professor Bill White in the Anthropology Department, Associate Professor here. He got his degree from Boise State, his master's from Idaho, and then his dissertation from Arizona, but he's been here now for some time. He's worked throughout that region, the Idaho region, but also Arizona. And he's turned his also at the Caribbean, and his current research interests include community-based participatory research, historical archaeology, historic preservation, and heritage conservation. He's been active in this area, the Bay Area, I should say, our local area as well, and also using digital media to disseminate archaeological material content out there on the web, building websites, YouTube stations or channels, and Google Earth digital tours. And he's a blogger and a podcaster, and maybe some of you have listened to his blogs or podcasts, I guess, and ebooks, as well as his own academic paper book. At any rate, he is talking about something that I know I'm particularly interested in, and it's essentially a history of the last decade, 15 years, of sort of the situation here in the U.S. of Black archaeologists and archaeology, and so his title is kind of a nice expression of that, and we're looking forward to hearing about the past, but also the future of the Society for Black Archaeology. And so the title is Black+Archaeology, being a member of the Society of Black Archaeologists in 2025 and beyond. So quite timely and maybe a bit scary even.
Well, I hope to not scare you.
Oh wait, this isn't for you. You have your own.
I have one sewn on my shirt. Hey, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming and sitting in the dark at lunch and watching me talk yet again. This one is a really personal talk. It's going to be about, my pathway towards joining the Society of Black Archaeologists, how it kind of started, and then, what it means to me and some of the directions we're going in the future. And so to, full disclosure, I'm now on the board of directors for the SBA. I've been one of the members since the very beginning, so I've got a biased view for sure. But what I'm going to talk about is my own personal quest. It's not, necessarily the quest of everyone who's a member of the SBA. Okay, real quick, I'm going to talk a little bit about, my pathway through this entire maze. I've been doing archaeology for over 20 years now. It's kind of hard to say that. Makes me realize I have a lot more gray hair than I used to when I first started. But for most of that entire voyage, it was just me and a few other people of African descent that were doing archaeology in the United States. I'll talk about my colleagues who started it, a little bit about the organization, and then how I feel, what my role is and what role it plays in my career right now, and then the directions that we're kind of heading these days. So, like I mentioned before, I've been doing archaeology for quite a while. I'm from Idaho originally, which has, less than 5% people of African descent. So my entire life, I always grew up without ever hearing anything about people of African descent. The only Black people I knew were people in my family or went to my church. I went to the only Black church in Boise. It's now a historic property because it was one of the first Black churches in the state of Idaho. And Idaho is not known for its, strength in history, really, in public schools. And so my entire time was never hearing anything about Black history really ever at school. And my parents, I was a nerdy kid that really loved history. I never read fiction. I still almost never read fiction unless someone makes me. I always read nonfiction. And as a kid, I just read all these history books about, ancient Rome, Greece, the Wild West, all these different time periods. But my parents would never let me give reports on white history. I always had to choose Black subject, the first pioneer, the first inventor. And what I realized later on was that was about the only time that the kids in my class ever heard anything about Black history in Idaho. And my teachers, second and third grade teachers, that's the only time they ever really heard anything about Black history. So my entire time, I was always the only one that was talking about this in these classes. By the time I made it to high school, I took my aptitude test and they didn't see archaeology as a job. So they said it wasn't real and that I couldn't be an archaeologist and that I should just do something else. So I didn't want to. My uncles were in the Navy. And so I was going to join and be a nuclear engineer like my uncles. But I graduated when I was 17 and my parents wouldn't sign the forms for me to go into the military. So out of spite, I went to Boise State. I raged and went to college. And when I got there, that's when I realized that archaeology is one of the 4 fields of anthropology. And so that's why it never showed up on anything, because it wasn't an actual major at Boise State. I decided to stick with it and made my way through school, got 0 guidance. But along the pathway, I did realize that I liked archaeology. So when I finished at Boise State, the state of Idaho, there's only 2 places you could get a master's. And when I was applying for jobs, I kept getting turned down because I had no experience. I was just right out of school. And it was before they had Shovel Bums and other websites. So it was just me kind of like guessing where could I get a job. It wasn't until I'd been out of school for a year or so that they told me CRM even existed. Great work, BSU. I mean, we almost won the Fiesta Bowl, right? So we're good at football. Not so great at student counseling, though. But when I went to Idaho, that department has contracts with agencies. So that's the first time I ever did cultural resources. I didn't know that that is what most archaeologists do. So I started when I was, a master's student, and that really, I realized that A, it was a job because I was actually getting paid to do it, but B, that this was what I really wanted to try to do for my career, that I was going to move forward. Still, this entire time, I was getting workforce training and everything, but I never really saw anyone like me ever do this. None of my professors, none of them were ever, coming from the direction that I was coming from. But the idea to still do archaeology of the African diaspora, it was still in the back of my head. And I went to the University of Idaho, which doesn't have a archaeology program of any Black communities or whatever. But my advisor at the time, Mark Warner, he knew other people and he had done his master's in Maryland on African American neighborhood. So he encouraged me, like, go to the SHA conference and see, if anyone's doing any projects and try to sign up there, because Idaho can't provide it, but maybe you can get it on somewhere else and maybe you can get it for somewhere else. So I went there. I think I saw one other person of African descent at the whole SHA conference, which is the biggest historical archaeology conference. I was once again all alone, but I met Paul Shackle and Chris Fennell, and they were doing a project at New Philadelphia. Now it's a National Historic Landmark, but then it was just a cornfield where it was the site of the first town platted and subdivided by an African American in Illinois. And so they invited me to come along. And then when I was out there, I met Cheryl LaRoche, which is a professor at the University of Maryland. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anyone of African descent do archaeology. I finished my bachelor's. I'd wanted to do it since kindergarten, made it all the way to my master's. And that was the first time I ever saw anyone Black who was an archaeologist. And I was talking to her about it, like, where are all the Black people in archaeology? And she said, well, there aren't very many, but what you do, focus in on African diaspora, it matters. Because in the United States, I didn't know at the time, but in the United States, those sites are overlooked. That's not really a priority of US history to cover Black heritage sites, but people want to know. And so you should continue going on this path. And it was the first time that I ever met a Black professor that offered to be my mentor. And so that's when I actually really knew I could do it. That even though I would never see anyone else who was African descent doing archaeology, maybe for my whole career, if they could do it, I could do it. And so seeing someone else, that was huge for me, to see that someone else could do that for their job. Like I said, I'd gone my entire life, 20-something years, before I ever saw anyone who looked like me do archaeology or have those interests. And I was also fortunate too on that project that they did have a wide range of students from different backgrounds. So it was also the first time that I ever worked with Black students in archaeology. I had classes with other Black students, but here we were doing archaeology. And that was also the first time that had ever happened. And when I finished, I started doing cultural resources. And for several years, I kept doing CRM. And I think in the entire time, all these different companies, I only ever saw one other person of African descent at any of these companies, CRM companies, ever. And so I just had this idea that something had to happen. Like somewhere out there, there are other Black people who want to do archaeology. Where are they? How can we get them, to come together and at least, at least talk with each other, engage with each other in some way? And I guess I wasn't the only one. I didn't know this at the time. In 2010, my colleagues Ayanna Flewellen and Justin Dunavant, they went to the SHA and they also saw how there was like one other person of African descent at the entire, meeting. And so they were also wondering, like, where are the people of African descent? How come there's not a different committee, just like there is at the American Anthropological Association of people of African descent? How come there's no one in there? And so they came back and decided that they were going to start their own archaeology association, right? So it's critical to look here. Ayanna was an undergrad when she decided that she was going to start an archaeology organization. And folks who are PhD students, like the second year is not the time to start your own organization. But they did it, right? And they really did it to just see what would happen. Would there be Black folks that would materialize? Would other people of African descent be archaeologists? Could this be something? And then the other thing was to really figure out, what would that role be? Is it going to be a subcommittee like the American Anthropological Association of the AAA? There's, African Diasporic, African American Subcommittee. Is it going to just work with the SAA or the SHA? What's going to happen? And folks who had been waiting for years before me, like Teresa Singleton, Cheryl LaRoche, they were like, finally, this is happening. They had been waiting decades before even me, right? So at that point, there was like 5 Black SHA members who joined the Society of Black Archaeologists. And they rolled it out, and I'm sure they did not know what they were doing when they started it, right? But over the years, they kind of figured it out, right? So, this picture on the left is all of us in 2017, 6 years after the organization had been out. That's as many folks as ever showed up. And then this picture is from January, and that's only showing like just the people who made it to the SHA conference. There's about 230 or so members of the SHA right now. So it's gone from about 7 to 230. But even at 230, if everyone who was a member of the SBA was of African descent, that would still be less than 2% of all the archaeologists in the country. And they're not all Black. So we're looking at about, 0.5% of all the archaeologists in the country are of African descent. And that's gone up from like 5, right? So just the kind of situation that's going on is huge growth. It's really amazing to see the fact that there's this many folks, of African descent. It's great to see so many students coming through, so many people that are now professors and working at CRM companies, but still, it doesn't reflect the population of the United States. So, a little bit about the Society of Black Archaeologists. It took us years to figure out, what are the things that we stand for? What is this thing going to really be about? And what it is, we decided that it was going to be a professional organization. So not a conference, not a magazine, not some committee. It was going to be its own standalone thing that would have its own goals, right? And so the top 2 is to, ensure ethical treatment of African diaspora sites, but also increase the number of people of African descent to do archaeology. So now we're at the point where there are students that can mentor each other. There's, several professors. There's folks working at CRM companies, plenty of folks who started their own company that are all part of this. And, they also, as being members, this is on the top of their mind. But then the other thing too is to think about African people worldwide and how they have not always been included in decisions about archaeological sites. A lot of what ends up happening is really networking and connecting behind the scenes of communities that are getting cemeteries destroyed, shrines destroyed, people who are losing their jobs and stuff. Try to connect them with resources and other things that will help them move forward. And so a lot of what goes on is really networking. It's not even necessarily exchanging, money. It's connecting to the people we know to help protect these sites or to help communities, right? And the entire thing, folks who are part of it, they're committed to community-based work and engaging with communities, right? So a couple things about it. You don't have to be Black to join the SBA. A lot of people think that. They don't, it says it in the name, but what it really is an association of archaeologists who have taken those 5 precepts, that they care about African diasporic sites, African communities. And so, you don't even have to be an individual. There's a lot of organizational members. There's a lot of CRM companies that are members too. And so the enrollment of the SBA is growing, but it's not growing just because Black people are part of it. What's growing is the network of colleagues who are all working together, sharing ideas and working towards these same goals. So once again, another thing too, as someone who is on the board of directors for the SHA, it's not just an organization to have a conference every year. I mean, it drove me wild being on there, how oriented towards just having the conference was just, that's what they were really all about. There is a online conference for the SBA in September. We've decided to keep it online so that people around the world can join up so that they don't all have to travel to the same place at the same time. But the goal is to try to increase the capacity of Black communities and increase the number of African American and African diasporic archaeologists. So the goal is to help people write, help people get grants, help people get jobs, help navigate contracts, navigate bureaucracies, and navigate institutions where they're at, really. So the goal is to cultivate a group of folks who have taken an ethical commitment to care about African diasporic sites and communities. And like I said, that whole community thing is the very beginning and the end of the SBA. It's trying to create a space where folks can learn all about the full range of what it is to be a human being and to really work on these African diasporic sites. Because, of course, like I said, I didn't go to school to be an archaeologist. I went there to be an anthropologist. And so there's a lot of cultural anthropological work that we do, a lot of interviews and conversations with communities. And a lot of times this is the first time that they've ever been consulted on anything in their neighborhood about any stuff that's going on. They've never had really anyone pushing for their sites. And so a lot of it is really ethnography that then we're adding that to it. And so it's not any different than anyone who's doing community-based work, except for, you're trying to help people of African descent in this case, right? All right, so, we're in an interesting phase, to say the least. I hope it doesn't end up like Humpty Dumpty, right? So right now in 2025, all that power that a lot of these allies that once had 5 years ago has melted, right? It's melting fast, right? That whole standing up for Black Lives Matter, many of those folks who are all about that, they don't even return emails anymore, right? So the reason why they're not doing that is because of this real thing that's going on, right? That they are organizing against stuff like this. And that's definitely something that the SBA has to always be mindful. And all the people who are, members, they really need to think about it, right? Because we come from the standpoint that learning about us and our communities is not DEI. And it shouldn't be DEI for anyone to learn about their own heritage, right? But there's some other people that see Black in the title and all of a sudden it's DEI, right? Nevertheless, the need to support each other remains, if not increased even more, because we have plenty of colleagues that work and live in places where they're not allowed to say the word race at work. They're not allowed to write actual tribal names in their reports. They're not allowed to even acknowledge that they are Black because they live in a place that has legally mandated them to not say that, right? And so we've got other people who have more flexibility. Supporting individuals who are going through that, who are not allowed to even acknowledge their own identity. I mean, that's huge, right? That's really one of the main things that we're doing these days. That's what the support has really moved into. Of course, like I said, Justin and Ayana did not really know what they were getting themselves into, but fortunately for us, they figured it out. So, it does, rather than being a subcommittee of the Society for Historical Archaeology, it's its own not-for-profit organization. And because of that structure, there is a bit more independence, right? For example, the SBA is able to create its own endowments, to offer its own scholarships, to work with people to get funding that works in, that aligns with the mission of the SBA, right? So That's something that the SBA can do. It can get its own grants on its own. But also on the other hand, it doesn't have the protections of a lot of the bigger organizations. So it has to have its own legal defense and its own insurance and its own legal guidance, right? So all of that stuff is a learning curve for many of us to figure out how to manage this. But it's growing, right? There's more people, and what's happened over time is we've been able to provide more services, right? So there's regional writing groups for folks that work in CRM, folks that work at universities, students, where we all get together and encourage each other. People who are trying to publish for journals, we get encouragement there. We actually work on some mechanics with people who are having troubles in other spaces, and it's regional across the United States, right? So when you sign up, you can join the reading group, you can talk with folks, you can bounce ideas off folks, and you can actually just improve your own writing. There's also, mentorship and assistance as far as scholarships and grant writing too. So you can join up, you can find someone who's in your area, your country, and try to match with, someone who will help you with grant agencies. So that's another big thing that's going on. And once again, as it grows larger, then it's not just Justin and Ayana doing everything. So what it means for me as someone who's been doing this for so long is finally I have a place where I actually in fact belong, right? It's not just community-based work. And so when you're of African descent and you're among people who understand what that means, and you can be yourself around those folks, right? That's the thing that was missing, and I think was keeping a lot of people from doing archaeology. They didn't all want to be the first person in their country, the first person at their university of African descent to do archaeology. Now that there's more support, we are starting to see people who are quite interested. They're joining up, and they're joining up because they now have a place finally to belong. So I've been reading this book, Let This Radicalize You, and just as I was reading through, after I said I was going to give this talk, I found passages that were just straight up saying exactly the way I feel, right? Because belonging is what folks all over this place are looking for. If you look at the way that people are behaving, they're acting like that because they don't feel like they have anywhere to go. They think that no one cares about them, right? So having a place that someone cares about you, it reaffirms that you are a human being, that you're part of a much larger thing, that you finally have some place that you can not just complain about stuff, but get energized to go out there and try to make things better. And so, when you have a place where you feel like you belong, you don't have to wear the mask all day, right? We walk around wearing these masks all the time. You can actually be yourself, right? But it's not just relaxing and chilling and being yourself. You're taking responsibility and trying to make things better. For the longest time, I worked in cultural resources where I actually had gag orders where I was like not allowed to talk to communities. It was against the rules to mention what we were doing because everything was supposed to be like hidden and secret until the time the government was going to spring it on everyone, right? Well, when I started to do archaeology with community and stuff, you start by asking a long time, years before you even dig. So you know a lot more, and they actually understand what you're doing because you're organizing it along what people need, what they think as far as making things better, right? So archaeology for the longest time just literally digs your stuff up and takes it away from you and puts it somewhere where you don't get it anymore. So if you start where you're asking before you even do anything, then you're not just taking, right? You're actually trying to become part of something. And right now, the way things are going, caring about each other is the biggest form of rebellion we could even do. If you think about the way that they're talking about stuff, if you click on the news, if you listen to that inauguration, it was designed to make you afraid and alone and feel like you're scared, right? When you start to care about other people and you start to join things and be part of something, then you're not alone, right? Because every time they talk about this stuff, when disasters happen, people come out of everywhere to help each other. And they don't cover that. They only cover the disaster and the people that were harmed. They don't talk about the millions that come together to help after every problem, because we are part of cultures, right? If you start to care, then you're finally doing what they don't want, right? Because it's harder for them to do what they want to do when people care. When you actually hope that things can get better, that's what I learned being a part of the SBA, that it's not just CRM contracts hogging sites out of the ground for another Walmart. And it's not just another senseless article that no one's going to read, right? It's doing something that actually makes you feel good, and it gives people hope. So as we move forward, all we're going to try to do is maintain what we have been doing. But one of the critical things is support each other, right? Because like I said, building all those people and then placing them in places where they're under assault by anti-Black violence and anti-DEI efforts, like that's not going to help. Supporting people and maintaining that community, that's the key piece that's going to keep going. In our last meeting, when we were all together a couple weeks ago, everybody said that community and sense of belonging, that was the one thing that they got out of the SBA. Not learning how to write, grants, scholarships, it was having a place to be. So it's just staying open and staying out there. That's the thing that we want to keep going. Then of course, still taking those calls and emails by sites that are getting destroyed, helping communities that want to get, historic properties listed in the National Register. That's stuff that we're going to keep doing. Then of course, support our students and professionals. Of course, those things we're, like I said, trying to build endowments so that scholars in Latin America and Africa can actually come to the conferences, but also so that they can get access to resources, because a lot of times they don't have the same articles, and to get them in their languages, because for some folks, just being able to speak English is already a privilege, right? So having these things accessible for folks is another thing, right? And I have a feeling as long as we keep supporting and keeping things open, we will keep growing and keep offering the things that people get, and then continue to build our networks with communities, but also with government agencies and the CRM companies that have been supporting us all the while. Still just stay on the course. All right, so like I said, I didn't come here out of nowhere. I've been doing this for a long time, and there's a lot of folks that helped me along the way, right? My colleagues here that started the SBA and kept me going, that there wouldn't even be an organization if they hadn't done it, because like I said, I was already doing archaeology for 10 years and I didn't try it, so good job. Those other few, Black archaeologists that took time to talk to a student, a graduate student, and encourage them to keep going through, they'll never know how much that meant. Then, the folks that gave me a chance there, Dr. Paul Shackle, he passed away. It really hit me kind of hard, because I remember one time I asked him to help me, and I said, well, don't you have to write because you're a professor? And he goes, I don't have to do anything. I have tenure. And now that I have tenure, I understand Dr. Mullins was speaking from the heart, right? Anyway, there's some great folks. And then my advisor, Maria Nieves-Cedeno, who doesn't do historical archaeology and just for whatever reason decided to take me on as a PhD student, right? And then all the folks that I hope folks would watch this video and join up. People in the future that I can't know will watch this. So, thank you very much. Everyone here, thanks for your time. I want to make sure there's enough time for questions though, so thanks. You're in it right now. We're live. This is a live studio audience.
First of all, Bill, thanks a lot. And thanks to Lori in particular. We've had a strong interest in some of these areas here at Berkeley over the last decades. And I also appreciate your pushing belonging. So everybody come to the reception next Wednesday.
Yes, please.
We need these communities. But one interesting question, I definitely find that the emphasis on identification, curation, preservation, and so forth of African diaspora sites to be really important. But I'm also wondering about the dimension of the group that would encourage people who are Black, identify as Black, and or not, and want to work on other kinds of archaeological sites. My personal experience with one of our former students, my co-director, is that when one works on, and this is part of the discrimination that still exists, when someone like that works on a site that's not African American, African diaspora or anything, they say, why don't you go back and do your own history?
Yeah.
So I just wondered if there is discussion or anything about that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, right? Because like I said, there's folks that are worldwide, and folks that are in Europe are not always working on African diasporic sites. They might be working on, classical sites or Neolithic sites, right? I do not know every European country's chronology. I only know years and then how many before and then how many after, right? So I don't know. But yeah, there's folks, especially if they're working in CRM, they're not, you know, necessarily working on things that are associated with the African diaspora. And there is a pushback, you know, and here we're talking about, you know, 80 to 90 people of African descent doing archaeology. In Scotland, there is not 80 or 90. You know, in the UK, there is not. In Belgium, there's not. And so there's kind of trying to make sure that our doors are open to talk to them about that, right? That they are doing the right thing by going into archaeology. They don't necessarily have to find the only African Scottish sites to dig, you know, to be considered a real archaeologist. And if they're going to stop you, you know, so some of that is like within the organization, especially like a student, right? Students in a lot of ways have to do what the university is asking them to do, and they're because they won't get the checks to get the degree, right? So in some ways, it's like we're there. We don't have a lot of agency to force your department to let you do that stuff. However, we can help them, support them through doing archaeology and just kind of reaffirm like, yeah, it's 2025 and they can work in their own country because they're a citizen of that and they're working on this stuff. And so, yeah, we do try to support that way. But like I said, we can't force people to help a student get their degree. On the other hand, when there are companies that rip sites of African diaspora, we can write letters and we can start working through legislators and stuff to say, well, this wasn't adequately treated under your law.
Well, there are a lot of members of the Society for African Archaeology,
Yeah.
which is a whole other entity and works in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of people of African descent.
Yes. Yeah.
Who are doing archaeology in Africa.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that because the AAA's African Diasporic group is going to have a SBA sponsored conference in Senegal in May. And many of those folks are also going to come too. So I've seen the list of folks that are going to go there. So like I said, trying to build networks with existing organizations, always trying to do that.
I want to just kind of add on to what Meg was saying. You know, one of the things that I think the society, and I'm a member, find it extremely wonderful, supportive space. One of the things I think the society will deal with, you know, it was founded by people who are at a particular moment in their career. The founders are now moving forward in their career. And I think awareness of some of the issues like mentoring and discrimination in mentoring or discrimination in pathway through the university, which I know has been experienced by people working in other areas. I think some of that mutual mentoring and support is going to become a larger part of the society, not just the pipeline at the beginning of the career, but supporting people through the career. And I think that's been one of the real incredible strengths of SBA is supporting that pipeline to make sure that there is a growing professional network of folks. So I think as the founders and the first generation go through the academy, you're going to find other ways that you want to support one another. And that'll be a sort of like changing landscape. So I think it's really wonderful to have your talk today and get a sense of that foundational past and the way that the society is continuously figuring out how they're going to move forward. Structurally, one of the things that keeps it rooted mainly in historical archaeology is the fact that the SHA gave the SBA a space on the schedule. And so there is this deep organic connection between those two organizations because of that. And you can talk more about that history.
Yeah, you're right. In the beginning, it was the Society for Historical Archaeology to give a roof in space. The SAA did not do that. And so it ended up, and we were going to both conferences, right? So they were like, you pay or you don't get anything. The SHA was like, well, let's just see what happens. So you're right. From the beginning, it has been the SHA. And then since then, both organizations have kind of like worked together, right? SBA board folks are also on the SHA board. Both groups are raising money to help with scholarships, and trying to get field schools and stuff and help members in those different ways. So they did grow, next to each other. Yeah.
Hi, Professor White. I just wanted to say first, thank you. This was such an amazing presentation. I feel so grateful and excited to be here. It's really fantastic to see all the work you're doing and to see a Black archaeologist, because like you said, we don't see many of them. I'm a third-year transfer here in the anthropology department, and I definitely want to do my work around the African diaspora, whether that's ethnography or archaeology. But is there any way for students to get involved with SBA or just be a part of this community, or is it only for professionals?
Is among the students. Most of the growth and activity is among the students. So you don't have to pay right away. Just send an email to SBA, get connected with some people, decide if it's worth it, decide if you want to pay for it, right? That's the other thing too. They're not necessarily asking for cash right up front. They want people to join and be part of it. And then if you can afford it, right? Because there are members in countries where they cannot afford it. Yeah. Lisa's.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Bill. I really enjoyed hearing about your experiences, and I found everything that you said very inspirational for the field of archaeology in general, especially in today's situation. And I just wanted to follow up with something that Lori said. I think the idea of strengthening networks seems really, really key to moving forward, both with the SBA, but also within the larger archaeological community. And just to come back to, discussion about how, those outside of the US and outside of North America could be involved, especially in Europe. I think having people further on in their careers who are becoming more influential and really steering the direction of research projects that get funded and that become projects that PhD students participate in is really, really important, because especially in the UK, but in a lot of European places, graduate students aren't open to be able to develop their own projects. They are there, it's like a job for a couple of years, and they have a position in an already developed project. And so that, I think, model really impacts the direction of research, and perhaps not in the ways that we want it to be going as a collective community.
Yeah. Is that one working? We'll try this. I'll talk into this one. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that, as we were talking about capacity building, the thing that I guess just talk about that. What we're starting to learn is really the bottlenecks that some countries have. Like, if you didn't work with this person as in their lab, and then you didn't work on this, like, you're not going to get a PhD. And that's new for folks from the United States who are used to just being able to go all over, and wherever you can take loans, you can just go to that school. So that is one thing that we're kind of, and you mentioned it before about wanting people of African descent to work on these Black sites, right? Like, we're really starting to realize the amount of power that's in some countries the advisor has over students. To us, it's like eye-opening to see that, right?
Thank you for the talk, sir. One of the things, just what you mentioned about power and thinking about trying to support one of our graduate students of African descent into a project where she had an entire, descendant community behind her from Oakland. We had the money, we had the backing of the super of a very unnamed flagship national park. We had everything we needed to get this thing going. And it was adjacent to a UC field station. Wow. Right? We had everything, and all the ducks were in a row. And one archaeologist, right, dodged us, ignored us. I sat on his desk for 4 hours waiting for him to come back to work one day, laying in wait for him. And I was just thinking about how frustrating that was. And that graduate student went on to do different things, but it was this moment where one person in power, and I was thinking how, as a coalition writing a letter, and the only African American ranger, in that park was there with me sitting on that desk, right? Like, we were there And this one person, I was wondering if we could leverage the power of the SBA, the SHA, and maybe file grievances through the RPA against somebody who would deny all of these things lined up just because it didn't interest him, you know? So it's the kind of thing where, you know, you said this belonging, this community, and this power, the power is there. And I think now is a time when we're feeling really, you know, beset, that the ability to fight a little bit, to be a little pugilistic about these kinds of things, makes me feel like, you know, that community is there. And I would have taken this on a different way, you know, now, you know, seeing and being inspired by the SBA.
Well, I mean, that story's too bad. That's the story we're actually kind of preparing for now, with everything just like sand in the gears, you know, with watching them try to put everything at full stop. We're kind of prepared for that thing. But also, you know, another way is like, if you ever get in a fight, you're probably going to get hit too. So the best way to, you know, make it through that is to be wise about which fights you go for, and is there an alternative way around it? Because, you know, folks with permitting power and stuff like that, like, you know, do you actually in fact need them for that student to still finish college? Do you need them at all? Is it worth even trying to do this, or can we take all our resources and go somewhere else? Because once again, it's less than 2% of all the archaeologists. So we're talking dozens of people here to go after an entire like agency. That might not be the best use of our efforts, as much as supporting the student and navigating around that roadblock to another aspect. You know, that might be more productive, right?
Nicely done. Sorry, it's me again. One of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking, and you mentioned scholarships through SBA, I think in this particular moment, we all need to collectively think about who we give money to, who might be able to help us sidestep some of the roadblocks that are going to be put up, and identify alternate sources of private money, private endowments, that, because NSF, I'm really worried about whether archaeology is going to be seen as scientists enough, right? So we really need to be thinking about how we seek out other sources of safe money, and how we support those with our giving and our kinds of support, whether it's reviewing grants or donations. So I was wondering if there's been time for there to be any discussions within SBA about ways that some of what you're doing might be mobilized in that way.
Get my
I'll
steps
meet you
in
halfway,
today.
yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because right, like, it seems like it was an age ago when we had the conference, and that was 2 weeks ago. So the speed at which things are moving, I think maybe just maintaining support for folks is the critical piece, right? Because there's an untold number of grant funded things this university, right? Entire departments of soft money that are now just like poof, you know? So everybody's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. The key is to try to be there for those folks so that they're able and resilient to handle whatever does happen, right? Because there's no private cash in this country that's going to replace the National Science Foundation's funding for science, right? We're just not going to put it into that. So what are we going to do if that doesn't come back for archaeology? Or, you know, what are we going to do for the folks that are already in? How can we help them make it through? And then how can we continue and to carry on if this doesn't come back, right? Like, those are the kind of things that, rather than necessarily thinking about what's our attack in this moment, maybe we should just band together, support each other, and wait to see what's going to happen. Because I mean, I'm not the, you know, oldest crayon in the box, but I've seen knuckleheadery happen quite a bit from DC. So don't worry. Don't worry. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Let me check it out. Okay, so in the chat it says, great presentation. It's great to have you here at Berkeley. Oh, well, I think that every time I get paid too. I wonder if you've been able to do any outreach here on campus with some of the Black student organizations. I could see this as being very interesting for students to pursue majors that would dovetail with archaeology. Yeah, no, I have done some of that, but I remember the time that I've been here so far was trying to keep the job, and now I have it. So it takes, better part of a decade to just make it through. So now I actually have time and space. So, if the person's listening, please give me an email. That'd be great.
Thank you. Just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. I think the work that you're doing is really important. And two, just thinking about the future of archaeology and youth, I was wondering if the SP has done anything with people not academia, like high school, middle school, starting young to get people interested and know that they do have a place in this field.
I'm glad you mentioned that. As Meg and Lori know, Alexandra Jones, who graduated from here, has a company called Archaeology in the Community, and that's all she does is bring archaeology to public schools in the DC area mainly, but travels around the world and has gone to a lot of different places and brought archaeology to students. And actually, that's a feature of this department. We still go to elementary schools and take archaeology kits to students. And so that's just a part of what it is here at Berkeley. And as far as the SBA, yeah, we do connect with students. We always try to make sure there's plenty of space for elders, plenty of space for youth to come to the sites where we're working at. But if there's any ideas of how we can reach out without a bunch of more, like if we can leverage already the stuff we're doing to much larger audiences, just let me know.
I just have a comment actually. And I think at this point, I'm just echoing what several other people have already said in slightly different ways, that I think that going back to the idea of building and strengthening community networks is the key to our future, our collective future. And, those of African descent may be a minority in the world of archaeology still today. But certainly not in the larger community. And I think, and those supporting doing this kind of work are also not in the minority, I think. And it feels like at a time when we're a government that's ruled by whatever populist opinion is at the moment, that there's a lot of room to leverage that support within the community. And I think we need to work pretty hard at doing that in future. And I think it might be a little bit more effective than being confrontational about it, which just seems to get archaeology in hot water all the time.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. Like if you think about the people that are in this room in the last 10 years, it's been pandemic after this, after collapse, after everything, right? But then between that was everyone's, first day of school and kids going to Little League, and the flowers come back every day and people get married and have kids, right? So if we just focus on all that good stuff that's actually already happening, yeah, we're much more aware of all the stuff that's going on around, but all of that happens against the backdrop of our everyday lives, right? So I think you're right, like the joining together, supporting each other, that's the key piece so that we actually have a sane mind to deal with stuff. Is there any other questions?
I'd like to say thank you, Bill. We run over a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
So if there are any questions, they can ask you individually. I'm sure people can find you. You're listed in the email links on campus. So thank you so much for being our opening talk, because you've given us some concepts of hope, which we all need, plus also some concepts of community, and we're moving forward and seeing things that start small and get bigger. So
all right, good. Yes. Thank you.